November 13th, 1942. The waters of the Solomon Islands lay shrouded in tropical darkness. Off Guadalcanal, a long line of Japanese cruisers and destroyers pushed silently through the night, their bows slicing black waves, their gun crews ready for another of the Imperial Navy's feared nocturnal strikes. For months, the Japanese had ruled the darkness of the Pacific, their Tokyo Express convoys delivering men and munitions under cover of night, their long lance torpedoes reaping a deadly harvest among Allied ships. They were confident, almost certain, that tonight would be no different. But hidden within the American task force steaming to meet them was something new, something invisible. Inside the cramped, dimly lit combat information centers of U.S. cruisers, men bent over strange, glowing screens. A low hum filled the compartment as vacuum tubes warmed. Thin green lines swept in circles, and ghostly blips flickered into view. To the untrained eye, it was nothing but static. But to the radar operators, many of them no older than 20, it was the future of naval war. They were watching the unseen. They were watching the enemy. For the first time in the history of sea battle, American ships were tracking their foes not by moonlight, not by flares or desperate lookouts straining their eyes, but by radio waves. The operators spoke calmly, almost in whispers, as they passed coordinates up the chain of command. Officers marked bearings, distances, speeds. Long before a single Japanese lookout raised an alarm, the U.S. Navy already knew the position and movement of every ship approaching Iron Bottom Sound. On deck, the night remained silent, the sea unbroken. But deep within the steel hulls, orders crackled, turrets swung in the dark, heavy barrels pivoting toward invisible targets. Gunnery officers waited, hands poised over firing triggers, and then, without warning, the first thunderous salvo erupted. Muzzle flashes ripped the night open, blazing across the water like jagged lightning. Shells screamed overhead, and within seconds, explosions tore into Japanese ships that had never even glimpsed their attackers. The Japanese sailors, trained to trust their eyes and the element of surprise, staggered in disbelief. How could the Americans fire so fast, so accurately, in utter darkness? On the bridges of cruisers like the Hiei and Kirishima, commanders barked frantic orders, but it was too late. Shells detonated in engine rooms, decks shattered, flames leapt skyward. To them, it felt like being struck by a phantom hand, unseen, unstoppable. The Americans had not only matched Japan's vaunted night-fighting skill, they had surpassed it. The sea, once a cloak for the Japanese Navy, had been stripped away by a weapon no one could see, no one could hear, and almost no one yet understood. Radar, mysterious, invisible, and deadly precise, was rewriting the rules of naval war. That night in the Solomon Islands, the ocean itself seemed to light up with fire, and the balance of power in the Pacific began to shift. To understand how the night off Guadalcanal was transformed, we must step back a decade, long before American destroyers fired their first radar-guided salvo. In the 1930s, radar was a fragile dream. Across the Atlantic, British scientists at Bawdsey Manor experimented with bouncing radio waves off passing aircraft. In America, a handful of engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington quietly tested crude sets, their oscilloscopes blinking faintly as waves echoed back from ships in the Potomac. At first, it was little more than a curiosity, a scientific trick with uncertain purpose. Yet the storm clouds of war demanded more. By 1939, with the Pacific bristling under Japanese expansion, the U.S. Navy searched for tools that might offset Japan's superior fleet. They knew the Imperial Navy trained relentlessly in night combat, mastering torpedoes and long-range gunnery. America's sailors lacked that experience. Technology, not tradition, would have to be their answer. Early prototypes, designated the CXAM series, were bulky, temperamental, and enormous. The first units were mounted on carriers such as Yorktown and battleships like California. Crews complained of the fragile vacuum tubes, the endless maintenance, the eerie green glow that gave them headaches. But in exercises, these primitive sets achieved something that the keenest eyes could not. They detected aircraft 50 miles away, even through haze and darkness. Commanders took notice. By 1940, the technology leapt forward again. MIT's newly founded radiation laboratory in Cambridge became the crucible of American radar. Brilliant young physicists, some fresh from academia, others fleeing Europe's turmoil, labored around the clock, refining oscillators, magnetrons, and cathode displays. They worked in secrecy, knowing that the smallest breakthrough might one day decide the fate of fleets. Radar's promise was not limited to detecting airplanes. Engineers began adapting the sets for ship-to-ship tracking. Imagine the power. A destroyer able to sense another vessel long before a lookout could glimpse a silhouette. A cruiser able to train its guns on an enemy hidden by storm or night. For admirals haunted by Japan's reputation in night actions, the concept was irresistible. Yet skepticism lingered. Many traditionalists in the Navy trusted the sailor's eye more than a flickering electronic screen. "You cannot fight a battle on ghosts," one officer remarked. And indeed, radar was not perfect. Signals were sometimes lost, clutter confused operators, and early sets struggled with precision. But every month, refinements sharpened the picture. The Japanese, meanwhile, dismissed radar almost entirely. They believed their superb optics, night binoculars, and disciplined lookouts made it unnecessary. Their confidence in the human factor would soon prove a fatal miscalculation. By the eve of Pearl Harbor, a small handful of American warships carried operational radar, though few sailors fully understood what it could do. To those who manned the sets, it felt like possessing a sixth sense. Echoes appeared on the screen like whispers from the dark. Each glowing blip represented steel and men somewhere out there, moving, vulnerable, and real. The technology was still raw, but its potential was staggering. For centuries, naval battles had been dictated by daylight, moonlight, or the luck of a lookout's eyes. Now, an invisible force had entered the seas. Radar promised to turn the cloak of night into no protection at all. In quiet laboratories and aboard experimental ships, America had begun to open its secret eyes. Soon, in the crucible of the Pacific War, those eyes would see further, clearer, and deadlier than the Japanese ever imagined. Once America grasped what radar could mean for survival at sea, the full weight of its industrial might swung behind the technology. In Massachusetts, Cambridge's radiation laboratory became the beating heart of the effort. More than 4,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians worked there, an extraordinary concentration of brainpower, rivaling even the Manhattan Project in scope and secrecy. Their charge was urgent. Take radar from fragile prototypes into rugged machines that could survive the shock of battle at sea. Every day, breakthroughs arrived. New magnetrons that shrank size but multiplied power, circuits shielded against saltwater corrosion, displays made clearer for sailors under stress. But invention was only the first step. Production had to scale. And in wartime America, scale meant industry on a colossal level. Factories once turning out radios or consumer appliances were refitted almost overnight to produce radar sets. At Western Electric, RCA, General Electric, and Raytheon, assembly lines ran day and night. The scenes were striking. Women in coveralls hunched over long benches, soldering delicate wires with hands trained only months earlier for typewriters or sewing machines. Train cars rumbled out of New Jersey carrying crates marked "Top Secret," guarded by military police. Each held radar components destined for destroyers in the Pacific or aircraft circling Britain. By 1942, output climbed from dozens of sets per month to hundreds. Destroyers received the SG Surface Search Radar, a compact unit capable of detecting ships at nearly 15 miles with startling accuracy. Carriers and battleships mounted the larger SK sets, able to sweep the skies for incoming bombers. Even small landing craft were gradually outfitted with simplified versions. The invisible eyes of radar were multiplying across the fleet. Charts and numbers tell the scale. In 1941, the U.S. Navy possessed fewer than 20 reliable shipborne sets. By the end of 1943, it had more than 3,000 installed and operational. In the same period, Japan managed only a fraction of that number, with most of their sets plagued by weak power and poor reliability. America's factories were not merely keeping pace with battle losses, they were flooding the oceans with an advantage the enemy could not match. Secrecy cloaked every shipment. To the average sailor watching cranes lower crates aboard his ship, the equipment might look like just another radio or rangefinder. Few were told what it truly was. Radar was considered so vital that it ranked alongside code breaking and the atomic bomb in classification. A captured set could compromise the war itself. The story was not only about machines, it was about a nation mobilized. A machinist in New Jersey, a physicist in Cambridge, a young woman winding coils in Chicago. All were part of the same invisible weapon. They would never see the Pacific, but their work would decide who lived and who died in its dark waters. By the time American fleets steamed toward the Solomon Islands, radar was no longer a fragile experiment. It was an industrial reality, forged in laboratories and hammered out in factories at a pace only the United States could achieve. And soon, in the crucible of night battle, it would prove its worth. Radar's baptism of fire came not in quiet exercises, but in the chaos of the Pacific's first carrier battles. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, American carriers Lexington and Yorktown entered combat with radar operators standing watch in their dim, humming rooms. When Japanese aircraft lifted off from distant decks, they expected to appear suddenly, high above the horizon, unopposed. Instead, radar operators detected them more than 70 miles away. Within minutes, American fighters were scrambled, climbing desperately into position. Though the battle cost the Lexington and many lives, radar had done what no lookout could. It had bought precious minutes, the margin between disaster and survival. A month later, at Midway, radar again proved decisive. On the morning of June 4th, radar screens aboard the carrier Enterprise glowed with approaching echoes. Operators called bearings into the bridge, and commanders sounded the alarm. Pilots raced to their planes as the first Japanese strike neared. Fighters rose just in time to blunt the attack. Without radar, the Americans might have been caught flat-footed. With it, they had a fighting chance, and Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. Yet it was not only in the skies that radar's promise unfolded. At sea level, its greatest test loomed. By autumn 1942, the campaign for Guadalcanal had become a grinding struggle. Japanese destroyers raced down the slot each night in high-speed runs known as the Tokyo Express, bombarding American positions and landing troops. Their skill in night fighting was legendary. Long-lance torpedoes, sharp-eyed lookouts, flawless coordination. American sailors feared the dark, knowing the enemy seemed to own it. But radar began to change the equation. On American cruisers and destroyers, SG surface search radars detected ships long before any human eye. The operators calmly reported ranges and bearings. Target bearing 085, distance 12,000 yards. Bridge officers could maneuver with certainty, knowing exactly where the enemy lurked. For the first time, the Japanese advantage in night vision and discipline was slipping. Still, radar was not a magic wand. Crews struggled to interpret the screens, to translate echoes into firing solutions under the strain of combat. At times, coordination faltered, officers hesitated, and opportunities slipped away. But each engagement sharpened their skill. Each clash reinforced the lesson. Radar was not merely an aid, it was a weapon in its own right. In the words of one American officer, it was like lifting a veil. Suddenly, we were not blind in the night. The Japanese had no such veil to lift. They continued to rely on optics, flares, and instinct. Their doctrine had been perfected for decades, but in the black waters around Guadalcanal, it now collided with something new, something their admirals barely understood. The first skirmishes were small, but the message was clear. America's invisible eyes had opened, and the Pacific would never look the same. As the fall of 1942 bled into November, larger forces gathered for a showdown in Iron Bottom Sound. Radar would no longer be a supporting tool. It would be at the center of battle, deciding whether fleets lived or died in the dark. The waters north of Guadalcanal came to be known by sailors as Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard where ships and men vanished into black depths. And in November 1942, that graveyard became the proving ground for radar. On the night of November 13th, an American task force steamed into the slot. 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. Their mission was desperate: stop a Japanese bombardment force led by battleships Hiei and Kirishima from shelling Henderson Field, the fragile airstrip that kept Guadalcanal alive. Radar operators aboard the light cruiser Helena were the first to see it. Echoes flickered on their screens, columns of ships approaching in formation. Bearings and ranges were called in calm voices, contacts at 27,000 yards closing fast. Yet on the American flagships, confusion reigned. Callahan distrusted the strange green blips, preferring the reports of his lookouts. He delayed giving firing orders until the Japanese were perilously close. When the first guns opened, the 2 formations were barely 2 miles apart, point-blank range for battleships. What followed was one of the most chaotic melees in naval history. Searchlights stabbed the night. Shells erupted at near-zero distance, ripping through decks. American destroyers darted forward, loosing torpedoes before being torn apart by Japanese gunfire. The Hiei thundered broadside after broadside, yet she too was hammered, set ablaze by shells from cruisers guided, in part, by radar bearings. For hours, the dark waters boiled. Ships collided, burned, and sank. When dawn broke, more than 24 vessels had been destroyed or crippled, American and Japanese alike. Admiral Callahan himself lay dead, his flagship, San Francisco, battered. But the Japanese mission had failed. Henderson Field still stood, and radar, though not perfectly used, had played its first deadly hand. 2 nights later, the clash resumed. This time, Vice Admiral Willis Lee commanded with the battleship Washington at his disposal. Unlike Callahan, Lee trusted his SG radar absolutely. At midnight, operators reported targets: Japanese battleship Kirishima and her escorts closing in. Lee held his fire until the range closed to 8,400 yards. Then, with deliberate precision, he unleashed the first radar-directed battleship broadside in history. The results were devastating. Shells from Washington tore into Kirishima with uncanny accuracy, smashing her turrets, flooding her engine rooms, and setting her aflame. Within an hour, she was a burning wreck, later scuttled by her crew. Not a single shell from Kirishima struck Washington. Radar had given Lee the ability to see, aim, and strike before the Japanese even knew where to turn their guns. But radar was no guarantee of invulnerability. At the Battle of Tassafaronga in late November, American cruisers, confident in their radar advantage, attempted to ambush Japanese destroyers. They detected the enemy, maneuvered into position, and opened fire with a storm of shells. Yet the Japanese responded with their deadly long-lance torpedoes. Within minutes, 4 American cruisers were ripped apart, 1 sinking, 3 others crippled. Radar had given sight, but tactics and torpedo superiority still counted. These night battles revealed both the power and the limits of the new technology. Used wisely, as Lee had done, radar transformed the battlefield, allowing American gunners to strike with lethal precision in utter darkness. Used poorly, without coordination or doctrine, it could not prevent disaster. Still, the tide had turned. For the Japanese, who had once dominated the night with discipline and stealth, The revelation was sobering. Their vaunted tactics of surprise no longer held. American guns now reached for them in the dark, guided by invisible hands. By December, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound were littered with twisted metal and silent wrecks, American and Japanese alike. But beneath the surface carnage, a deeper truth was emerging. Radar had shifted the balance. The U.S. Navy was learning, painfully and quickly, how to fight with technology the enemy could neither see nor match. From that point on, every night engagement in the Pacific carried a new rhythm. Radar screens swept, operators called bearings, guns swung into position long before human eyes caught a glimpse of the foe. For Japan, the ocean's darkness was no longer a shield. It was a trap. In the black waters off Guadalcanal, amid fire and ruin, radar had proven itself as a weapon of war. And the Japanese Navy, once so confident in its mastery of the night, had been forced to confront a chilling reality. America could now see them everywhere they went. Amid the thunder of guns and the glare of searchlights, it was easy to forget that radar was not simply a machine. It was men, young, often untested, hunched in dim, humming compartments deep inside steel hulls. They were the hidden eyes of the fleet. In the cramped radar rooms of destroyers and cruisers, the atmosphere was unlike anywhere else on the ship. There were no sweeping views of the ocean, no sea breeze or smell of cordite. Instead, the world narrowed to the soft glow of cathode ray screens and the hypnotic sweep of a green line. Operators sat with headphones pressed tight, their voices calm but urgent as they read off bearings. Contact. Range 15,000 yards, closing fast. Many of these men were barely out of high school, plucked from small towns and trained in months to interpret what only scientists had understood a few years earlier. For them, the responsibility was crushing. A single hesitation, a misread echo, could mean a cruiser struck by torpedoes or hundreds of lives lost. One operator later recalled, "I never saw the enemy that night. But when I called out his bearing and the guns answered, I felt the ship shudder, and I knew men were dying out there in the dark." Some found pride in that knowledge, others guilt. Letters home captured the strange mixture of detachment and horror. "We fight ghosts," one sailor wrote to his mother. "We see them as dots, and then suddenly the sea is burning." Leaders like Admiral Willis Lee trusted these men implicitly. Lee himself was known to spend hours in radar rooms, listening to the steady cadence of reports. His faith in their judgment allowed him to unleash the devastating volleys that sank Hiroshima. In those moments, the calm voices of 20-year-olds guided the most powerful battleships afloat. On the other side of the ocean, Japanese sailors had no such luxury. They strained their eyes in the dark, relying on instinct, on binoculars, on flashes of light across the horizon. For them, the sudden, unerring fire of American guns seemed supernatural. They never saw the hunched figures behind green screens, the sweat running down their necks, the young men who, in silence and anonymity, turned the tide of war. Radar's story was therefore not just about circuits and magnetrons. It was about human nerves, about men who shouldered a burden no one had ever borne before. The burden of seeing what no one else could, and acting on it in the space of a heartbeat. They were the hidden watchmen of the Pacific, and though few outside their crews ever knew their names, their voices in the darkness saved fleets, and perhaps the war itself. To the sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the ocean's darkness had always been a trusted ally. Their doctrine of night fighting was honed across decades of drills and war games. Crews trained to launch torpedoes by instinct, to read silhouettes in the faintest starlight, to coordinate with uncanny precision without radio chatter. In the opening months of the Pacific War, this mastery had humbled the Allies. At Savo Island, in August 1942, Japanese cruisers descended under cover of night and annihilated an American force, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour. To the Japanese, it was proof that the night belonged to them. But by November, doubt crept in. Survivors' accounts from the battles around Guadalcanal record confusion and disbelief. Lookouts shouted alarms, but shells were already crashing into their decks before they glimpsed an enemy silhouette. Officers assumed the Americans had somehow perfected their searchlights, or that they had improved fire control optics beyond expectation. Few could imagine a technology that allowed ships to detect and track targets miles away in pitch black. One Japanese officer later recalled, "It was as if the enemy knew our every move. We approached unseen, yet they fired as though it were daylight." Another survivor from Kirishima described the shock of receiving accurate salvos at ranges where no human eye could possibly spot them. Rumors spread that the Americans had a supernatural weapon, some invisible power that stripped away the night itself. In truth, Japan had dabbled in radar development. A handful of experimental sets had been built, with limited range and fragile components, but their production was minimal, and few frontline ships carried them. The Imperial Navy remained convinced that traditional night optics and the discipline of its crews would remain superior. It was a fatal miscalculation. By the time Japan realized the scale of America's radar deployment, it was far too late to catch up. Their industry, starved of resources, could not match American mass production. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese sailors had once sailed into darkness with confidence, sure that their eyes and torpedoes gave them the edge. Now they entered night waters with dread. Every shadow, every wave might conceal American guns already aimed, already ready to fire. Their famed long lance torpedoes could still wreak havoc, as at Tassafaronga, but even those victories felt Pyrrhic, achieved against an enemy that seemed to grow more watchful and precise with each passing month. For the Japanese Navy, the realization was devastating. The cloak of night, their proudest advantage, had been stripped away. They were fighting an enemy who could see them when they themselves were blind. Radar had not only altered tactics, it had eroded morale. Darkness was no longer their friend. It was the Americans' weapon. By the dawn of 1943, the transformation of naval warfare in the Pacific was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy, battered but unbroken, had emerged from the gauntlet of Guadalcanal with a new weapon that was more than a machine. It was a doctrine. Radar had given sight where none should exist, and in doing so, it had begun to shift the balance of the entire war. Every major warship now carried radar sets as standard equipment. Destroyers steamed with the SG Surface Search Unit glowing in their darkened combat centers. Carriers and battleships mounted the powerful SK air search radars, sweeping the skies for incoming raids. Even escorts and smaller craft began to receive simplified versions, ensuring that no corner of the fleet was blind. With each new installation, the invisible net stretched wider, binding the Pacific into a map of echoes, bearings, and certainty. The tactical impact was immediate. Convoys once easy prey for Japanese submarines and surface raiders could now maneuver with forewarning. Radar picket ships, destroyers stationed far from the main force, extended the fleet's eyes hundreds of miles outward, detecting incoming air raids long before they reached striking distance. Pilots who had once scrambled at the last possible moment now had precious minutes to climb into formation. Anti-aircraft gunners who once fired blindly into the haze now had precise direction. At sea, night engagements took on a new character. No longer did American captains dread the hours after sunset. Instead, many sought battle in the dark, knowing that radar turned the tables. The Japanese, once masters of nocturnal tactics, increasingly found themselves on the receiving end of sudden, devastating ambushes. In 1943 and 1944, as the island-hopping campaigns surged across the Central Pacific, radar-equipped task forces cut through Japanese defenses with growing confidence. The strategic effect rippled further. Radar did not win battles alone, but it multiplied the effectiveness of every other asset: aircraft, artillery, carriers, submarines. It allowed the U.S. Navy to synchronize operations on a scale the enemy could neither match nor disrupt. By the time of the great carrier battles of 1944, the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, radar was integral not only to ships but to aircraft as well. Fighter direction officers, working in coordination with radar operators, vectored American Hellcats directly into the path of Japanese raids. The result was slaughter from which the Imperial Navy's air arm never recovered. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it became known, owed as much to radar coordination as to superior planes and pilots. But radar's legacy was not written only in victories. It was also written in lives saved. Each early warning that allowed a convoy to scatter, each air raid detected before it struck, each torpedo spread, evaded by a ship forewarned. These represented hundreds of sailors who returned home rather than sinking into Iron Bottom Sound. Technology had always been part of war, but rarely had a single innovation made such a direct difference in survival. After the guns fell silent in 1945, radar did not fade into obscurity. It became a permanent fixture of the modern world. Civilian aircraft were guided safely across continents. Weather forecasters peered into storms once invisible. Air defense networks knitted across continents, preparing for the nuclear age. The very way humanity saw its skies and seas had changed. For Japan, the lesson was bitter. Their overconfidence in tradition, their reliance on optics and night-fighting skill, had cost them dearly. When they belatedly rushed to deploy their own radar sets, it was too late, too few, too fragile, too poorly integrated into doctrine. No amount of courage could overcome the widening technological gulf. Yet radar alone did not secure victory. Machines are only as effective as the men who use them. The story of radar in the Pacific is also the story of trust, of commanders like Willis Lee who believed in the glowing blips, of operators who steadied their voices under pressure, of crews who learned to fight in a new way. Where others hesitated, they adapted, and in that adaptation lay the seed of triumph. The contrast was stark. On one side, an authoritarian empire clinging to old methods, convinced of its superiority in human skill. On the other, a democracy that embraced invention, empowered its scientists, and harnessed its vast industry to mass-produce what seemed impossible. The struggle between them was not only fought with shells and torpedoes, but with ideas about how to fight, how to change, how to use knowledge as a weapon. In the waters of the Pacific, radar had turned night into day. It had stripped the enemy of his most trusted ally and given the Americans an edge that grew sharper with each passing month. By the war's end, the Imperial Japanese Navy lay shattered, its fleets sunk, its sailors gone. Among the many reasons for that collapse, radar stood silent but undeniable, a ghostly hand that guided the shells, warned of danger, and illuminated the path to victory. And so the story of radar is not just a tale of machines and circuits. It is the story of a war in which courage met technology, and together they reshaped history. It is a reminder that in the crucible of conflict, those who adapt survive, and those who cling to old certainties are left behind. The night once belonged to Japan. After radar, it belonged to America. And in that transfer of power, the course of the Pacific War and of the modern world was changed forever.